Okay, Bert, I think we'll just start.
Okay, let's get started. Open discussion. Pauli, I think we have answered a lot of questions already during the presentations, but there might still be one or two left open. I've seen that there was a question about the difference in the human actionable aspect as opposed to the machine actionable aspect. We said a few words about it, but I'm not sure if that question was actually answered in full. So if there is still in the audience a question that was not answered during the presentation, then please raise your hand and we can take that in again. And I see Philip is raising his hand. So Pauli, can you give the word to Philip? And then afterwards, there is another person also raising his hand. So if you could guide that process, would be perfect.
Yeah, Philip is on the line now.
Okay, so this is really more of a comment on the theme of human versus machine there. I saw the I guess, intentionally provocative statement that if data isn't fair, then it is, what was it, almost reuseless.
Reuseless, yes.
Yes.
That's the term that was a provocative statement.
Yeah, I mean, I like the statement. It makes people think, but I think there is a danger of pushing people who are more towards the human reuse side away from understanding and wanting to follow FAIR principles by, maybe this is the right audience for saying something like that, but in general, I think this could be a problem. And I would also like to say that I think probably, in my guess, the majority of data that has been reused, if we look at the last 50 years of science, is not computer reusable. So data isn't necessarily not reusable if it is only human readable.
Yes, that is definitely the case, of course. But you know, our mission in life here is to assure that this data is reusable also from a machine point of view. What we see also is that, and we have talked about FAIR this morning. Internally in our office, very often we also use FAIR also for the term fully AI ready. And that means if you want to be AI ready, then it has to be machine actionable, it has to be machine readable. And there are, you know, not only in medicines, not only in this medical field, but also in other fields, we see that the amount of data, the size of data files is getting so big that it is no longer doable for the human eye to take this all in and, you know, to come with ideas or to test an hypothesis or whatever. So for us, it is absolutely vital that we as teams make a big push in terms of the machine readability of these data sets. Last time I talked with Barend Mons about this. He also said, Bert, the machine has to know what we mean. The machine has to know what we mean. It's almost like this mantra from the film The Matrix many years ago. But it is important that we put a lot of effort in that case. It doesn't mean that people should not be reading articles anymore, but it is important that, particularly when you do research in certain fields, that we push for the machine readability and definitely the machine actionability of this of this metadata.
I can also answer part of that. So there are two things. So I think that the fact that some metadata, some data are made for humans, as you say, doesn't exclude the possibility of also providing them with machine actionable metadata, and because that will itself help in making those data more discoverable. and vice versa, having machine actionable metadata doesn't preclude you from also presenting the data or the metadata for humans to read. So that is not the case. But it's true that in this study and what we have done, we have, we are following the FAIR principles hardcore. That is to say that we disregard basically any non-machine actionable element, and this is because there is no other way to evaluate that other than completely manually, obviously, since it's made for human consumption. So in this survey, since we want to be reproducible, and we will, by the way, redo this evaluation in about 2 years from now, and then we will compare and look at the evolution, so to speak, of these 100 or so repositories, and see if we can hopefully see a positive trend in making them fairer. And I think at some point we will also be able to detect that the data that are fair also have a bigger impact in science over time. But yeah, that's I totally get your point, Philip.
Okay, thanks. Good answers. Yeah.
Okay, let's have Ginte. Ginte, you are now online.
Okay, can anybody hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
We can.
Yes. I would like to come back to the question of APIs. So I represent a data repository which was tested and didn't score very well, and I suspect it is because we use OI PMH for all machine actionable stuff. And I'm just wondering what conclusions we could draw from that. Does it mean that it's just not testable with this test you used, or does it imply that our findability is limited in general? Because I'm not sure how real-life data harvesting works. Is there a wide variety of APIs supported, or?
No, so I can at least begin to answer that. If you're talking about the evaluator, that only supports the REST API, and there is the problem is, as I mentioned in my presentation, there is no standard way for repositories to declare that. If you, a reader, are a machine, then go to this place to extract machine actionable metadata. That's why this evaluator just harvests whatever it finds on the landing page or the FAIR digital object. And your second part of that question as to whether it means that your data is less findable, well, certainly from a machine actionable point of view, it is. But I should add that since we explicitly stated that we haven't intentionally looked for other API data, but for OAI PMH, it is possible to simply direct the evaluator to that to those kind of data. So if you have global unique identifiers for the data sets, you can provide them to us, and we can run it on the same setup that we have done the other tests.
Okay, so it doesn't mean we necessarily have to have REST API to be findable unfair?
It does mean that for this, the way we have executed this evaluation, and in principle also for the evaluation tool, but OAI PMH is essentially just XML HTTP. So there's nothing that prevents it from also digesting that, if as long as it contains recognizable metadata.
Okay, and for other harvesters, let's say Google Scholar, is it a problem? Do you think it would be a problem?
That I really cannot answer.
Okay.
I'm not sure how Google Scholar
okay, thank you.
works.
Well, maybe Erik. Erik, are you online? Can you say something about this question from Ginte?
Yeah. So I think in a way, we're sort of on different meta levels here. I think Ginte's question is exactly what FAIR is designed ultimately to answer to, which is, implementations out there that more and more become, amiable to the FAIRification functions, regardless of what the standards and the implementations are. So maybe it's worth a comment about Mark Wilkinson's evaluator, and I hope I don't overspeak for him or misrepresent him in some way, but I think Mark has a kind of a mission. It's more of a scientific, or I would say scholarly type question. He's interested in trying to show FAIR implementations using World Wide Web protocols, which might be like HTTP and REST interfaces. He is a believer that, or at least he would like to accept the challenge that we could try and implement the FAIR principles using existing World Wide Web protocols and nothing else. And so his approach to the evaluator is really at this level of, wow, given the Wild West of the World Wide Web, what can we do? How far can we push it? And how would things have to change in order for them to become more fair in the context of World Wide Web? I suppose, and I'm not a technical person, I'm a humble biologist here, but I think what can happen is evaluators could be designed on different assumptions or principles. And then in those evaluators, machine actionability might look a little different. And then coming back to Ginte's question, if Google Scholar is indexing in one way and the evaluator is indexing, a little echo there, and the evaluator is indexing in another way, then there's a kind of inherent incompatibility there. But then that just takes us to the next level. How do we resolve, or how do we expand or generalize two different systems to more and more become interoperable? So I think it's sort of this escalating scale of interoperation. I think that's a trend, a long-term trend in computer science. And I think we're all sort of in somewhere in an intermediate zone right now, and we're trying to evaluate where we are and what has to happen to get to that next level.
Yes, thank you. And my question wasn't to discredit the tests. It's just that as a repository, our ultimate goal is to providing the best platform we can for our scientists to share their research.
Indeed, and it's actually, it's the most apropos question, I think, because from the Go FAIR point of view, the way Bert and I spend our time, we're trying to look for some kind of balance between standards and incentives that will pull people in on some value chain that will pull people in to use or adopt a particular kind of standard. So in Go FAIR, we're really looking at this landscape of standards, technologies, implementations, incentives, social, technical systems, and trying to look for strategic alignments where we can get more convergence. So I think your question is straight on. It's the central question in Go FAIR.
Yeah. Yes, there's also, there's a final thing that I would like to say to Ginter also and to others. There's always a risk, if you work in terms of scores, because there can be the assumption or there can be the feeling that a certain repository is not doing a good job. And this is something that we really want to avoid at this stage. This is not about, let's say, having a qualification here on the quality of the repository or of the service of the repository, not at all. We are really using this in terms of measuring the fairness according to certain tests that we have available at this moment, and then monitor it over time in terms of, will it go up if certain actions will take place based upon these recommendations. So bear that in mind, because you may get maybe a bit of an uncomfortable feeling if your repository is scoring very low at a certain stage. And there can be technical reasons for it, there can be other reasons for it. But what is important is that it opens up a dialogue in terms of, okay, why is this score the way it is? And what can we do as a team, as a project to improve it and to actually help over time to sort this out.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ginta, and very good question. Thank you. Pauli, who's next? I see Martin.
I had a little technical problem, so I'm not host anymore, so I can't. Next one is Martin Mathiesen, but before someone gives me back the host or co-host.
I will allow. Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Martin, we can hear you.
Okay, so yes, hello. So yeah, I'm Martin Mathiesen from the Language Bank of Finland, and I'm actually one of those centers that scored very low on the FAIR scale. And I understand the points that you just made, and I want to talk a little bit about the cost factor, because when you say it would be basically very easy or relatively easy to score higher if you never do changes to data behind a PID. But that can mean that you need to keep data sets online that have only had very small changes, and changes where humans don't care but machines would be. Like, as a concrete example, fixing a name in a directory in a zip file of a 500 gigabyte data set. I've actually done that. So a machine would stop working and a human would be confused, why are there two PIDs for essentially the same data set, and need to read the fine print, why this change has happened and what the point of this all is. And of course, keeping 500 gigabytes online just to score nicely with FAIR seems possible, but there's cost involved. And so that was one point I would like to make. And the other one is it was said there's no standard way. And so it's either REST API or not FAIR. And I think this FAIR is a bit of a problem because nobody wants to be unfair. But I understand that obviously it means having data in a machine readable form as much as possible. And I fully agree that that is a valid goal. So, but of course, I think repositories can also be, like it was said, great repositories and accept the fact that for cost reasons and other reasons, they can never score really very high on the FAIR scale.
Yeah, so maybe I can respond to this.
Go ahead.
Indeed, when we talk about attempts to verify either data or services, there's kind of the abstract view of it, which is, where do we score on some scale of fairness, and what would it take to become more fair? And then there's the practical issues that I think that are really well embodied in what we are more and more calling data stewardship. A good data steward will have a budget and will be operating on behalf of some institution or organization that has policies and priorities, and they will be making decisions based on those policies and budgets and mandates to prioritize their own efforts in good data stewardship practices, among those fair practices. So I think it's entirely within the realm, and it's really going back to Bert's statement of, you know, the fair maturity indicators are not meant to be punishments or, you know, a grading scale of who's best and who's worst. It's really meant, as the name suggests, to measure a level of maturity on the fairness scale, and then therefore provide a kind of road mapping for, you know, given your resources and things that are available to you, what's the easiest way to move forward to increase fairness. So I think these are when you combine the aspiration to go fair with the actual budgets that you might have to do it, that becomes really a very good data stewardship exercise, in my opinion.
I would like to add that it's not only cost. I mean, my example was also about basically human users, because a machine is perfectly happy with the fact that there's a typo in a directory name in a zip file when unpacking and further processing it. But a human might not like it. And if you have to have two versions of the same thing just to make the machine happy, then that confuses the user. And I think that's something that you need to take into account. Also, if you retire the data set, then you have a tombstone page. Then you don't get the same data that you got before. And will scripts ever be, or machines ever be able to deal with a tombstone page without basically breaking? That's also something that I never quite understood. I mean, data is not there forever.
Yep.
No, but I think, Martin, we have to make a clear distinction here between the metadata and the data. I think in terms of the data, you're absolutely right. And it doesn't make sense to have you know, a large file of 500 gigabytes constantly online just to get a better score. But that is not what we're trying to achieve here. What we're trying to achieve here is that the metadata, which is typically not huge files, but relatively small files, that they are actually machine actionable. And that is something that can be done, not at great cost, but at, I would say, very reasonable cost and very reasonable effort also. So let's absolutely be clear that there's this distinction between the data itself and the metadata. And here we're focusing upon the machine actionable metadata.
Yeah, and I can add to that also that at the moment, this evaluator really, there are just a very few, I mean, maybe two indicators among the 22 that actually explicitly address the data itself. It is, or maybe four, but the focus is, as Bert says, in this evaluator as it is today, the focus is heavily on metadata, and that's what our focus also has been. And what the example you are giving with the tombstone is basically the case where I had the several panels in my presentation where of fair digital objects. I can show that screen now. In the case where the tombstone case is essentially the same as the panel 4, the fair restricted access, data restricted access. So the PID is still there, the metadata is still there, but the data is inaccessible. And that's still completely fair. and the evaluator would only fail on those 2 or 4 tests that are related to the data itself.
I don't know whether I can have a follow-up question, but did I then misunderstand this FAIR exercise? Because I thought that it was primarily about the metadata. I understood that, so that machines can basically make their ways through the metadata, but I guess researchers rarely want to study metadata, they want to study data. And so if then after the machine has traversed the metadata, the data itself is not machine actionable, doesn't that defeat the object a little bit of FAIR principles?
True. I mean, yeah, clearly, ultimately, fair data is also the goal. But in terms of this version of the evaluator, the focus is primarily on metadata. But that doesn't mean that all aspects of FAIR are being explored. It is just what we are currently able to think of ways of testing and evaluating aspects of these FAIR digital objects or data sets. So you're completely right in that having the data itself also fair is part of the goal, but it is only being tested to a small extent at the moment, and I think it will take time before that aspect can be fully explored.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Also, I think it's important that as a researcher, that first you look at the metadata which is available for your research, and then typically, if you see that something is very valuable, you also want to understand exactly, where is that data? Can I access the data? What type of data is it? How large is the data? Because, for instance, if you're interested in, let's say, genome data, then very quickly we're talking about petabytes. You don't want to download petabytes through WeTransfer or through whatever mechanism. You don't want to do that. So what we see also, Martin, here is we see a shift from exchanging data in the traditional way that we've always done it to visiting data. The data stays in the place where they are, and smart algorithms and smart queries are actually fired off if allowed to do certain things to, let's say, to take these parts of the data that are relevant for your research. So I would say that you have to start with the metadata first to understand what is there, and in the first place, and only afterwards you will look at the data sets in terms of size, in terms of what can you do with it? Is there a license? Can you get there? And so that will raise, let's say, follow-up questions.
Thanks very much.
This is Martin. It's a very potent question. I would like to come back again with one more comment. So also in my own slides, when I showed the schematic of a FAIR data point, the way the system was working, I was pointing to exactly the same data set in 2 different file formats, one text file, the other an RDF. So obviously the FAIR cascade will end at the text file. The computer won't understand that. But when it's rendered as RDF, the computer can actually dive into the data set itself and investigate it. So I think there's a vision of FAIR that allows for grades of fairness. And this comes to the other point that I would like to make is, Andreas mentioned this earlier, I think one of the most brilliant things about Mark's evaluator tool is not just the 22 tests that are set up, but the fact that it is actually a community platform that allows and that requests additional tests from the community. And it's actually posing to the community the challenge to formulate and then bundle up the appropriate indicator tests for your community. And so it may be that in a particular research community, accessing the metadata is enough, and that we would not need indicator tests for the actual data. That could certainly be an option, and it's allowed for in the tool that Mark Wilkinson built. And I think that dimension of the tool has yet to really be explored. I have some experience with working with some communities who created some metadata elements that were important to them. And I'm working with Mark to try and create the 23rd maturity indicator. And then the preclinical trial community will have their own unique test that they can use when they evaluate data and services in their own domain.
Okay, is this enough about this? Did you, Martin, get answers?
Yeah. Yes, thanks very much. And I fully understand that this is a first step in an important one. I mean, if you think when the first FTP servers came out, it's actually interesting that we're talking about this only now. So this is, so I don't want to sound as though I don't appreciate the effort, but I just saw some problems or things that we need refinement. So thank you.
Okay, so
Thank you.
next one is Joachim
Philipson.
Joachim, raise your hand again so I can give you. And now you are online. Joachim, please.
Thank you. Those who know me know that I'm kind of a validation nerd or validation geek. But I'd first like to say that I think this tool created by Mark Wilkinson and his colleagues is brilliant, and it's a very good start and very usable. But I think there are aspects when it comes to, even for machine actionable reusability, that are not addressed as far as I can see yet. And I have complained in other contexts about the lack of taking validation of metadata standards into account. And the answer I have got, even from participants of the first FAIRmetrics study, was that, well, the R13 that says that metadata meet domain relevant community standards involves validation. But I mean, it's still not clear to what extent, what does it mean that domain relevant community standards of metadata are met, because I mean, you can use and profess to use a certain standard or profess to export into certain metadata standards, like the DDI used by Dataverse, or simpler metadata standards like DataCite or Dublin Core even. But if the repository still allows people, researchers, to put in whatever they can into those metadata fields without any validation taking place, then the exported metadata will fail to validate against those standards. And as a reuser, not necessarily an end user, but a reuser as a data steward who wants to, for example, transform the data from a repository into archival format, I have to be sure that the data that I get and that is purportedly exported in a certain format also validate against that standard. And I have made a small study and found that this is not always the case. I've examined some records from Zenodo, from Figshare, and from Dataverse, Harvard's Dataverse, and none of them are fully compliant with the metadata standards that they purportedly profess to adhere to. And I think this should be a validation, an evaluation criterion even of the FAIR principles, that at least when you evaluate repositories, that they actually keep their promises, that the metadata output that they produce, whether as exported exported records or in the standard default records, that they actually validate against the standard that they say they adhere to. So I'd be interested to hear any comments on that. For example, from Eric or others. Thank you.
Yes, Eric, this is definitely one for you. I know that you have you've worked on this field also.
Yeah. So you know, when so I worked with Mark on the current evaluator tool, and what was interesting to me is that at the time we put this together, there was really a lot of head scratching. How do we handle R 1.3, which is saying that in FAIR, data and services, metadata, that they are adhering to domain relevant community standards. And even to this day, Mark is still scratching his head. He says, I have no idea how we're going to measure R 1.3. In the meantime, in between the time we were working on this and now quite recently, in GoFair, in our efforts to just try and help to coordinate decision-making on FAIR implementation, we arrived at this idea of the FAIR implementation profile. And it's to say, you know, if you go through each of the FAIR principles and you try to enumerate as best you can, you know, what are the technologies and the standards that you will use to satisfy F1, globally unique and persistent identifiers. So maybe you list in that case all the identifier systems that you're using. F2, rich machine actionable metadata for findability. F3, that there's, you know, some kind of permanent link between your data and your metadata. There's ways of answering all of these questions. If it is to be machine actionable, then there should be explicit answers in each case. So it should be the case that the more fair you are, the more you can fill out what we call a FAIR implementation profile that describes your implementation choices. Then there's this other element, and then we come back to R 1.3, this other element of, okay, we've made choices to implement FAIR, but who are we? And on whose behalf have we made these choices? Certainly we could all make our choices as individual people, but then there's no guarantee of interoperation anywhere because we're just choosing our own. The larger the community, you could argue the more influential that their choices might be, and the better chance they get of other people reusing their implementation choices, because they might just be, you know, authoritative and influential. So there's this component of having a community that is making these choices. There's some group that's making these choices on behalf of themselves, but then sharing that or declaring that with other groups who are doing the same thing for their own purposes. So what it comes down to then is I think we accidentally discovered the answer to Mark's question about R 1.3. The FAIR implementation profile built on behalf of a well-defined community of practice could be the maturity indicator needed for R 1.3. And the reason we were confused about this is because we didn't really formulate the idea of, or let's say the relation of a community in terms of how, so the fact that you need a community, I think, it's a very fundamental concept in FAIR. I think you need to have a community before you can define FAIR implementations. And that's a surprise to me. It's a conclusion we've come to from a route of just trying to help people to coordinate on implementation choices. So this isn't necessarily about validation, but it is about, if I have a FAIR implementation profile, I could try my best to build my implementations towards that profile. If I cannot meet the expectations of that profile, I can always create a new profile and say, as a community, we have our own FAIR implementation profile. And then I think the idea of having actual validators installed that could run mechanical validations on these implementations is eminently doable. It seems to me like more of a technical problem, and could very well be done. But I think for me, the real breakthrough in the last year for me on these FAIR implementation profiles was that we need a community in order to begin talking about these choices. And if we define this community itself in a fair way, so there's a unique identifier, there's metadata, this community can exist in the eye of the computer, then you can list I think in a very rigorous way, in a machine readable way, the implementations that drive FAIR for that community. I'll leave it at that. I hope that's making sense and is relevant, Joaquin.
Well,
yeah, and I can just add also that, I agree that validation is a relevant aspect of an evaluator, and this is only happening to a certain degree, I would say, for some of the indicators at the moment. But again, re-emphasizing the fact that this is an early development phase of this tool, and I'm sure that this will improve over time. And as it improves, I think we will see more and more validation happening. I think the R13 issue is probably the more complex because it's so expansive that we will that's probably not around the corner. So most of the indicator tests are focusing on quite generic and trivial aspects of providing some machine actionable metadata.
Joachim, are you happy with these two answers?
Well, more or less a bit too relativistic still for my taste. I would say to evaluate repositories specifically, it might be possible to look at just their web forms and see what data types are they allowing, what kind of validation do they perform already in their input forms, and that should be possible to do by, at least semi-automatically or machine actionable.
Yeah. Well, there are, of course, also a number of initiatives, specifically, around the evaluation and the certification of the repositories. As you've seen that within FAIR is FAIR, which is another European project, they actually they look more, let's say, from the structure of the repository, and in terms of, you know, how's it organized, and what type of data types can actually be accepted at certain levels. So I would guess that at a certain stage, the work that we are doing is probably coming very close to what the activities are being done at this moment within FAIRification. And that could also give you, you know, an extra step in the right direction that you are looking for.
Okay, I look forward to that development.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Excellent question, Joachim.
Okay, thank you. I see that Philip has a hand raised, and I see that Kinte has a question, you know, questions and answers. But if you, Andreas, could check the previous question and answer, are they all checked or answered?
Yeah, I've marked those that I believe we have answered so far. I'm not 100% sure about the remaining ones, but maybe Philip has one of those, so maybe he can clarify that verbally.
Yes.
Okay, we give turn to Philip. You are online.
Yeah, I think that's a different Philip in the chat.
Okay.
Okay.
I think Joachim made most of my points here, but this problem of communities and the responsibility of over domain-specific repositories, and the difference between machine, or the presence of machine-readable metadata, and the usefulness of the machine-readable metadata in terms of redoing past analysis, say, is quite a problem. That a repository can get a very high FAIR score if it has fulfilled the metadata criteria for the people managing that repository, but the research that has deposited the data is not at all reproducible because the metadata are not appropriate for the domain science that did the research. So just to clarify, I can give an example here that a lot of the studies of ancient human DNA are, well, all of the data is deposited in GenBank, but none of the archaeological metadata, which allows an independent researcher to evaluate the reliability of those data, is deposited in GenBank. And generally it's deposited on the hard drives of the people that did the research. And this is problematic, I think, in terms of if we're evaluating the R part of FAIR, I think we can get a false sense of security on high scores there. So that's just open for comments from you guys. Yeah.
I can comment maybe because I showed or discussed a little bit this idea of the FAIR data point. And I don't think this is a profound answer to the question you've asked. But one practical element to go forward on this would be to say I have a FAIR data point which hosts this domain relevant metadata. So it gets it off the hard drives of those researchers and exposes it on a FAIR data point API, makes it linkable. And there are, within those metadata, links to the GenBank files. So trying to, I think this is also a revelation for me in the last year. Next to F1, I think F3 is the thing that really makes FAIR fair. That this idea that we're separating data from metadata, yet we're connecting them with a permanent link. This really allows your data to live anywhere in a completely distributed way, and then allows you to bundle your metadata in whatever way is most convenient in wherever you would like to store it. So it separates out those two functions. And I think I'm only just now myself beginning to appreciate the power behind that. So one solution to this to your problem would be, yeah, we have a FAIR data point for archaeological DNA. It points to data sets, whether they're in GenBank or anywhere else.
Okay, I mean that's a good point. I would say a problem there is one person's metadata is another person's data, as you know, and that what by the geneticist would be considered metadata is actually data for the archaeologist. So it's a community dependent division there.
Yeah, and maybe a question I would ask to you then, Philip, is it do you think this distinction between metadata and data is itself something, a definition that we could relax in the context of FAIR? Maybe there is just data.
Oh, I think we would have to,
yeah.
Definitely, very definitely.
Okay.
Okay, that was enough. What about the other, Philip? If you want to comment your question in question and answers, just raise your hand so I can do. But there is Martti Matiensen now. Martin, you are online.
Yes, if I may. So about this metadata, one person's metadata is the other one's data. Yes, we have that in the language community in Clarin, very much so, this problem or this discussion. But I still would not like to just say it's all data, because then I think you go too far, because I think metadata, or you need to have a concept of description of data, something that describes what is this, where is this from, and so on, and that can be somebody's data. Why not? But if you have data that doesn't have metadata, that doesn't have a description where it's from and what it's for and what the intention was, then I think you have nothing. I mean, if you have just a piece of text without context, without saying this is from this newspaper, then you have just that one piece of text, but you don't, to really interpret it, you should know where it's come from. So I would like to keep the distinction between data and metadata, while fully understanding that some people treat also description as data, and why not?
Yeah.
Okay. Then we have in questions and answers question from Ginte. This is every dataset evaluation run through on the online FAIR evaluator automatically made public in the evaluations catalog. Is it possible to, and the second question, is it possible to run an evaluation without providing an ORCID?
Yeah, I can answer that. First of all, so we have not used the public version of the evaluator for our study, but well, we have done it in the past, but this is not what we are presenting here. If you do use the public evaluator, then your result will be publicly available, but you can use a non-existent ORCID like 0000 for all the 16 numbers. I think that's pretty much that. There are some questions about README files. I feel that we have answered some of this discussion of human readable versus machine actionable, but possibly not entirely. So if those of you who Philip, I don't know the last name, but if you could clarify if that's okay, sort of settled now.
Yeah, I hope he raised his hand, and we have now Dejan. Dejan, you are online, okay, and we have Philip next after Dejan.
Dejan, you, yeah.
Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
now we hear you.
Yeah, I maybe a little bit sidewise, but I wanted to put a couple of questions inside this forum and hear a little bit of opinions and comments on them. So, or rather many questions just to kind of think about, is there any kind of clear understanding about responsibilities and authority when on how the data, metadata should be treated or packaged or formatted when it comes up to the researcher institution who has the ownership and the repositories itself? Then along the same line, can the same, let's assume, one data set live in several data repositories and be described in different ways and have persistent identifiers and have maybe slightly different metadata? And do we have any opinion about that? Then where lies actually, what is the authority and the responsibility of the repository with regard to metadata and data itself, and what is left to the service itself as a repository? That's what I mean. And what's left up to the researcher and to the institution who actually owns it? So it could be that for to start with, but it's mostly to understand who has the responsibility over what.
Yeah, well, just quickly, I think by now everybody knows that I'm really fascinated by this idea of a community at this point in FAIR. And I think this is a question that belongs at the level of defining communities that will claim some kind of ownership on the assets, whether those assets are infrastructural, like a repository maybe, or whether they are like domain researcher, like a data set or some kind of service that maybe they have. So I think that's part of the discussion. There's something very interesting and not completely obvious going on in FAIR that has to deal with, there are communities. They may be formal or informal. They may be large or small, authoritative or whatever, but implementations are being made on behalf of these groups. And then there's a question of understanding the rights and the roles and responsibilities for all those elements. And happy to talk further on this, but I don't want to.
But I was more along the side. Let's assume that one researcher who is actually employed by a certain university is producing some research material.
Mm-hmm.
So how much of this responsibility around the fairness is with the researcher? How much is within the services and the support that's provided from the university? How much is it, if you want to say, coming from the community that researcher is working with? I suppose standards and other much higher level implications are coming from the community. But on the practical side, choosing a repository and choosing to upload the same data set to the different repositories and follow maybe different guidelines, is what I'm trying to open for, is that who has the authority over what when it comes up to the research data? And it is not clear, certainly not, at least to me, who should take care of which aspects of this FAIRification process.
Yeah. Can I say something about it? What we see at this moment in many countries is that the funders are not only asking, but they're demanding a fair data management plan. So what you see is that more and more, and you will see that in other countries also, is that your grants in the future probably will only be, let's say, will only be approved if you deliver your plan on the basis of a fair data management plan. And so there will be a lot of, let's say, there will be a lot of responsibility for the researcher to actually make sure that he gets that data management plan in a certain format and with all the fair aspects into it. What we see more and more, and I'm not 100% sure about the Nordic countries, but I see it in Holland and I see it in other countries as well, is that data stewards actually are being a great help for these researchers to assure that these data management plans follow certain standards. They're using certain templates, they share these templates, and that ultimately these let's say data stewards can help the researchers to at least assure that there is a solid basis for his DMP. So that is something that we see more and more, and I foresee that this trend will continue, so that the researcher will have that responsibility, but he will be strongly supported by the data stewards, who are also already, let's say, organizing themselves in so-called data stewardship competence centers, so that they share certain things between different institutes, between different universities. And that is something that I will see more and more. And then I think on the basis of that particular data management plan, there's absolutely no problem if that particular data set is then stored in one repository and in another one and in a third one, as long as stick to that rules, or let's say agreement that was laid down in the DMP. Yeah, does that give you a feeling for let's say where that responsibility lies, or and where it will move to?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I can add to that.
Yes.
No, so I think, Bert is very right in that the DMP is typically something that would address this aspect of where lies the responsibility. If there is no DMP, then the responsibility again falls back to the researcher, and the researcher being employed by some organization may have a policy organization-wide that dictates some action or some guideline, and if not, then it's up to the researcher to choose a suitable place to publish those data, and then these aspects of fairness about possibly cost will also eventually come up.
Yeah.
So I think it depends is the short
But
answer.
do you expect that FAIRification process should come in interaction with the repository, or previously already at the data stewardship level at the university or at the institution where it's applied?
Yeah, I think.
So is it repository who is the, how would you call it, a garant, or the one who is actually implementing or helping to implement fairness to the data and metadata, or it should happen previously before deciding to which repository to upload the data? And I'm still working on the assumption the data might live in several repositories, or live for the short period in one repository and then not anymore. I mean, there is nothing that tells us that the data once uploaded to one repository will always live there, right?
Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, people may unwisely decide to publish their data in many different areas, and then with different identifiers, and then
I mean,
especially
now in the beginning when we are in process of building this.
Yeah, but I think still there's no right answer to your questions, because if the researcher chooses to use some service to publish his or her results, then I think a lot of the FAIR aspects, as I mentioned in my presentation, at the moment at least, lies with the repository.
Okay, so what you're saying is that right now we are in the roughly that FAIRification process is closer to the repositories rather than to the source.
Well, a lot of the indicators that we are testing or that Mark Wilkinson's tool is testing is related to, can be related to a to technology or to the repository platform.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah, I understand. I was just trying to make a distinction between the FAIRification process that happens at the home institution independently of the repository that is chosen, and also at the repository itself.
Okay, I think we need to quickly move on and try to complete the open questions. And I see there's another hand. Pauli, I guess you.
Yeah, Niklas is now online.
Yeah, we have time for one more question, I think.
Yeah, well, this is rather more a comment today, and that I think you should look at it. This is an opportunity for the repositories as sort of service providers in the academic landscape of helping the researchers becoming fair, especially if the researchers are being measured on how fair their data output is. And I think that's the most efficient way of getting this working, rather than waiting for that the researchers themselves or the universities where they're employed get their act together. Yeah, just a short comment.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, fully agree. Good. I think this ends the open discussion session. I would like to thank the participants enormously for their questions. I think they were very relevant, very good questions. So thank you very much. Andreas, I'll give the word back to you then for the next session.
Yes, and I will just use just 2 or 3 minutes to answer one open question, which I think was not addressed yet, and that was regarding this Bing and the search engines. So to clarify, the reason that the thing that I mentioned in my presentation was that it is due to the fact that Bing seems to be the only search engine that searches linked data. So the requirement for the indicator is that it either is that the metadata is either presented in a hash style, which means JSON or micro format, or in a linked data style, which means typically JSON, LD, or RDF. And that is at least according to Mark Wilkinson, not supported by any other search engine than Bing at the moment. And that is why that indicator is linked to that service.
And Andreas, was there also, if I remember correctly, I think, for example, the Google search engine does not allow automated API calls, whereas Bing is open to that.
Okay, that's possible also, yeah. Yes. I'm
so oddly
not
enough,
familiar
Google
with the very specifics.
Okay, yeah.
But obviously, hopefully, sometime in the near future, more search services will support these kind of things, and then this will hopefully be expanded. Okay.
Andreas, I think you are on mute.
Thanks. Yes. Yeah. So that completes the open discussion. Thank you all for participating in that, and for the panelists to answer. So we have a short session left, which is about the next steps. So the results that we presented here, which are still preliminary, but